For nearly a decade, the world believed the Soviet Union had already won the greatest technological competition in human history. They launched the first satellite. They sent the first animal into orbit. They put the first human in space. They achieved the first spacewalk. Every few months, another Soviet breakthrough shocked the world, while America struggled to keep up. Newspapers across Europe openly questioned whether democracy could even compete with communist science. Inside Washington, politicians feared something far greater than losing a race to the moon. They feared losing the future itself. Yet, just 8 years later, the American flag stood on the lunar surface, and Neil Armstrong uttered words that would echo through history forever. How did the United States go from being humiliated on the world stage to achieving one of humanity's greatest accomplishments? The answer is a story of ambition, tragedy, political courage, engineering genius, and one decision that changed history forever. To understand America's victory, we first have to understand just how badly it was losing. When most people think about the space race, they imagine two superpowers advancing side by side toward the moon. That image couldn't be further from reality. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, there wasn't really a race at all. There was only one country dominating space, and it wasn't the United States. The Soviet Union had transformed rockets originally designed for war into machines capable of reaching beyond Earth's atmosphere. Behind these incredible achievements stood an engineer almost nobody outside the Soviet government knew existed. His name was Sergei Korolev. Because of Cold War secrecy, his identity was hidden from the public for years. Soviet newspapers celebrated astronauts, but the man designing the rockets remained simply the chief designer. While Americans admired astronauts like John Glenn and later Neil Armstrong, the Soviets protected the identity of the mastermind responsible for their astonishing victories. Korolev's life itself sounded impossible. Years before becoming the architect of the Soviet space program, he had been imprisoned during Stalin's Great Purge. He endured brutal conditions inside a gulag, where many prisoners never survived. Eventually released during World War II because his engineering skills were too valuable to waste, Korolev returned with a singular obsession: building rockets powerful enough to reach space. Few could have imagined that a former political prisoner would become the most influential engineer of the 20th century. After World War II ended, both the United States and the Soviet Union raced to capture German rocket technology developed for the infamous V-2 missile. America recruited many of Germany's leading scientists, including Wernher von Braun, while the Soviet Union recovered valuable technology, engineering documents, and assembled its own team under Korolev. Both nations now possess similar starting points, yet it was the Soviets who accelerated first. Everything changed on October 4th, 1957. A polished aluminum sphere no larger than a beach ball crossed the night sky. It was called Sputnik. Technically, it was a simple satellite. Politically, it was an earthquake. For the first time in history, humanity had placed an artificial object into orbit around Earth. Every 96 minutes, Sputnik passed overhead, broadcasting a repetitive electronic beep that could be heard by radio operators around the globe. Those beeps became one of the most terrifying sounds of the Cold War. If the Soviet Union could launch a satellite into orbit, many Americans realized it could also launch a nuclear weapon across continents. The psychological impact inside the United States was enormous. Newspapers called it a national humiliation. Politicians demanded answers. Schools began reevaluating science and mathematics education almost overnight. Suddenly, space was no longer just about exploration. It had become the ultimate measure of technological superiority. Then, as America tried to recover, the Soviets struck again. Only 1 month after Sputnik, they launched Sputnik 2. This time, there was a passenger aboard. Laika, a stray dog from the streets of Moscow, became the first living creature to orbit Earth. Although the mission was never designed for her survival, the achievement demonstrated something even more important than the satellite itself. The Soviet Union wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating. America responded with hurried launches of its own, but early attempts ended in embarrassment. Rockets exploded seconds after liftoff. Some barely cleared the launch pad before collapsing into fireballs in front of television cameras. Around the world, confidence in American technology weakened while Soviet prestige continued to grow. Then came another devastating milestone. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin climbed aboard a modified Soviet rocket and became the first human ever to travel into space. His flight lasted just 108 minutes, yet it permanently altered the course of history. Gagarin didn't merely leave Earth. He completed a full orbit of the planet before returning safely home, proving to the entire world that the Soviet Union had achieved another technological miracle. Across Moscow, millions celebrated him as a national hero, while Soviet propaganda presented the mission as undeniable proof that communism had become the driving force behind humanity's greatest scientific achievements. For the United States, however, the moment was deeply unsettling. Less than a month later, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, but his mission was only suborbital. Unlike Gagarin, Shepard never circled the Earth, meaning that even America's response felt like another second-place finish. By then, a growing number of military analysts, politicians, journalists, and scientists had begun reaching the same conclusion: the space race was already over. The Soviet Union had claimed nearly every milestone that seemed to matter. It had launched the first artificial satellite, sent the first living creature into orbit, put the first human in space, completed the first orbital flight, and showed no signs of slowing down. Within just a few years, it would add even more historic achievements, including the first woman in space and the first spacewalk. With every success, headlines around the world reinforced the same message: that Soviet technology had taken an almost insurmountable lead, while the United States appeared destined to spend the rest of the decade chasing accomplishments that had already been claimed. Inside the White House, however, one man refused to accept that narrative. President John F. Kennedy understood that America could never win by simply matching each Soviet achievement one step behind. If the United States continued competing milestone by milestone, it would always be reacting instead of leading. The only path to victory was to redefine the race itself by choosing a goal so ambitious that neither superpower had yet accomplished it. Within weeks, Kennedy and his closest advisors began discussing what many of the nation's leading scientists considered almost impossible: sending a human being to the moon before the end of the decade. At the time, America possessed neither a rocket powerful enough for such a journey, nor the spacecraft, computers, lunar landers, or engineering experience necessary to make it possible. In practical terms, the United States was entering a competition for which it had barely begun building the equipment. To many experts, the proposal sounded closer to science fiction than national policy. But history has often been shaped by those willing to pursue what everyone else believes cannot be done. On May 25, 1961, standing before a joint session of Congress, President John F. Kennedy made one of the boldest announcements in modern history. He declared that the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. It wasn't a promise backed by certainty. It wasn't even backed by existing technology. It was, in many ways, a gamble. America had barely managed to send a man into space, yet its president had just committed the nation to accomplishing something no civilization had ever attempted. Around the world, the speech sounded almost unbelievable. Many scientists questioned whether the timeline was realistic. Some engineers privately admitted they didn't even know how they were supposed to build the machines that would make it possible. But Kennedy understood something deeper than rockets and spacecraft. Great nations aren't defined by the problems they face. They're defined by the impossible challenges they're willing to accept. The announcement instantly transformed the space race. Until that moment, the United States had been reacting to Soviet victories. Now, America had changed the rules. Instead of competing over who could achieve the next small milestone, the entire race became focused on one monumental objective: the moon. Suddenly, every previous achievement became part of a much larger story. The first satellite, the first orbit, the first spacewalk, remarkable as they were, would eventually become stepping stones toward the one accomplishment that everyone would remember.
The challenge facing NASA was almost unimaginable. The agency would have to invent technology that simply didn't exist. Engineers needed to build the most powerful rocket ever conceived, capable of escaping Earth's gravity while carrying astronauts, fuel, supplies, and the equipment necessary to land on another world. They needed to create computers compact enough to fly aboard a spacecraft, even though computers at the time filled entire rooms. They needed navigation systems accurate enough to guide astronauts across nearly 240,000 miles of empty space. They had to design life support systems capable of keeping humans alive in the vacuum of space for more than a week. They even had to determine whether the moon's surface was solid enough to support a landing. Some scientists genuinely feared the lunar soil might behave like deep powder, swallowing an entire spacecraft upon touchdown. The scale of the Apollo program became unlike anything the world had ever seen during peacetime. More than 400,000 engineers, scientists, technicians, electricians, programmers, mathematicians, machinists, and factory workers eventually contributed to the effort. Over 20,000 companies and universities supplied components, research, and manufacturing expertise. Entire industries evolved because of Apollo. The demand for lighter electronics accelerated the development of integrated circuits, helping push the semiconductor industry years ahead of where it otherwise might have been. Every success required thousands of invisible victories inside laboratories, workshops, wind tunnels, and testing facilities across the United States. While America mobilized its scientific and industrial strength, the Soviet Union appeared to remain comfortably ahead. Sergei Korolev continued producing extraordinary accomplishments. Under his leadership, Soviet engineers achieved another historic first when Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space in 1963. 2 years later, Alexei Leonov completed humanity's first spacewalk, floating outside his spacecraft while millions watched in amazement. From the outside, the Soviet program seemed unstoppable. Western intelligence agencies estimated that the Soviets were already developing enormous rockets capable of carrying cosmonauts to the moon. Many believed they would arrive years before the Americans, but appearances can be deceptive. Unlike NASA, which publicly shared much of its progress, the Soviet program operated behind a wall of secrecy. Successes were celebrated worldwide, failures were hidden. Explosions, design problems, political disagreements, and technical setbacks rarely became public knowledge. This secrecy helped preserve the illusion that Soviet technology was advancing without interruption. In reality, enormous problems were beginning to emerge beneath the surface. The Soviet space program wasn't controlled by a single unified organization like NASA. Different design bureaus competed against one another for funding, influence, and political support. Rival engineers often disagreed over rocket designs, priorities, and strategies. Instead of combining resources behind one clear national objective, internal competition frequently slowed decision-making. Sergei Korolev had managed to hold these competing interests together through sheer authority and respect. His leadership kept the ambitious lunar program moving despite constant political pressure. Then history took an unexpected turn. In January 1966, Korolev entered a Moscow hospital for what was expected to be a routine surgical procedure. Few people imagined the operation would change the course of the Cold War. It did. During surgery, unexpected complications occurred. On January 14th, Sergei Korolev died. Outside the Soviet Union, almost nobody understood what had happened. Most people didn't even know his name. But inside the Soviet space program, the loss was catastrophic. The engineer who had designed Sputnik, launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit, pioneered lunar probes, and personally coordinated the nation's greatest technological achievements was suddenly gone. The consequences became apparent almost immediately. Without Korolev, leadership fractured. Long-suppressed disagreements resurfaced. Competing design teams struggled for influence. Deadlines slipped. Engineering decisions became more political than technical. Projects that had once advanced with remarkable speed began losing momentum. Meanwhile, the Americans weren't slowing down. NASA experienced tragedy of its own in January 1967 when the Apollo 1 spacecraft caught fire during a routine ground test, claiming the lives of astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The disaster sent shockwaves across the United States and threatened to derail the ambitious lunar program just as pressure to meet President Kennedy's deadline reached its peak. It would have been easy for NASA to push forward in desperation, but instead, the agency made the difficult decision to stop and investigate every aspect of the accident. Engineers examined thousands of components, redesigned wiring systems, replaced flammable materials throughout the spacecraft, rewrote safety procedures, and implemented countless improvements that transformed Apollo into a far safer program. Although the tragedy delayed America's journey to the moon, it ultimately strengthened it by ensuring that every painful lesson became part of a more reliable spacecraft. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union faced a devastating crisis of its own. Despite repeated warnings from engineers about hundreds of unresolved technical problems, the Soyuz 1 mission was cleared for launch. Those concerns proved tragically justified as mechanical failures began almost immediately after reaching orbit, and during the return to Earth, the capsule's main parachute failed to deploy, causing cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov to crash at catastrophic speed and become the first human to die during a space mission. By this stage, the space race had evolved into something far greater than a competition of rockets and engineering. It had become a test of leadership, decision-making, and the ability to learn from failure. And by 1968, something remarkable had begun to emerge. For the first time since the launch of Sputnik, the United States was no longer desperately chasing the Soviet Union. It was steadily closing the gap, and within months it would accomplish something that would leave the entire world watching in disbelief. By the end of 1968, something remarkable had happened. 7 years earlier, the Soviet Union had dominated nearly every chapter of the space race. It had launched the first satellite, sent the first human into space, achieved the first spacewalk, and repeatedly demonstrated to the world that its rocket technology seemed years ahead of America's. Newspapers had openly questioned whether the United States could ever recover, and even inside NASA there had been moments when the gap appeared almost impossible to close. But while the world focused on Soviet victories, something extraordinary had been taking shape behind the scenes. Across factories, research laboratories, universities, and testing facilities scattered throughout the United States, hundreds of thousands of engineers and scientists were quietly building a machine unlike anything humanity had ever attempted before. The Saturn V wasn't simply another rocket. It represented the culmination of America's industrial power, scientific talent, and willingness to solve problems that had never existed before. Standing over 360 feet tall and producing more than 7 million pounds of thrust at launch, it became the most powerful machine ever built by mankind, a technological masterpiece created for one purpose alone: carrying human beings to another world. NASA understood that reaching the moon would require much more than a powerful rocket. Every stage of the journey had to work flawlessly across nearly 250,000 miles of empty space. Guidance computers had to perform calculations that were unimaginable just a few years earlier. Astronauts would have to survive days in the vacuum of space, and engineers needed to guarantee that a spacecraft could descend onto an unknown surface and then launch back into lunar orbit for the return journey. Every system depended on another, and every possible failure had to be anticipated before the mission ever left Earth. It was the largest engineering challenge ever attempted during peacetime, and unlike almost every scientific project before it, there would be no opportunity to repair mistakes once the spacecraft left the launch pad. While American engineers refined every detail of the Apollo program, the Soviet lunar effort was beginning to collapse under its own weight. The death of Sergei Korolev had left a leadership vacuum that no successor could truly fill, and rival design bureaus increasingly competed instead of cooperating. Political pressure continued to demand rapid progress, but technical problems multiplied faster than solutions could be found. The enormous N-1 rocket, designed to rival America's Saturn V, became the symbol of those struggles. Unlike the Saturn V, which underwent years of extensive testing before carrying astronauts, the N-1 repeatedly suffered catastrophic failures. Entire launch vehicles exploded moments after liftoff, engines shut down unexpectedly, and each failure pushed the Soviet lunar program further behind. For the first time since Sputnik, the nation that had once seemed unstoppable was no longer leading the race. NASA, meanwhile, had quietly reached a point where confidence replaced uncertainty. In December 1968, Apollo 8 became the first crewed spacecraft ever to leave Earth's orbit and travel to the Moon. Although the mission carried no lunar lander and had no intention of touching the surface, its objectives were no less historic. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders became the first human beings to witness the far side of the Moon with their own eyes, completing 10 successful lunar orbits before beginning the journey home. During a live Christmas Eve broadcast watched by hundreds of millions of people across the globe, the astronauts read the opening verses of the Book of Genesis while television cameras transmitted breathtaking images of the Moon below them. Then came a moment nobody had planned. As the spacecraft emerged from behind the lunar horizon, Bill Anders looked through his window and saw a brilliant blue sphere rising above the gray landscape. Instinctively, he grabbed his camera and captured what would become one of the most famous photographs in history, Earthrise. For the first time, humanity saw its entire home suspended alone in the darkness of space, fragile, beautiful, and without borders. Apollo 8 proved something far more important than simply reaching lunar orbit. It demonstrated that every major system NASA had spent years developing actually worked under real conditions. Navigation, communications, propulsion, life support, and mission planning had all succeeded exactly as intended. The Moon no longer represented an unreachable dream. It had become a destination. Inside NASA, confidence surged as engineers finalized preparations for the mission that would determine the outcome of the space race once and for all. On the morning of July 16, 1969, the eyes of the world turned toward Cape Kennedy. More than 1 million spectators gathered along Florida's coastline, while hundreds of millions more watched through television broadcasts in homes, schools, and public squares around the world. As the countdown reached zero, the 5 gigantic F-1 engines beneath the Saturn V erupted into life, producing enough force to lift nearly 3,000 tons of machinery into the sky. Slowly at first, almost as if gravity refused to let it go, the rocket began climbing away from Earth. A mission that had started with one bold presidential promise 8 years earlier was finally underway. 4 days later, after traveling nearly 240,000 miles through space, Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit. Michael Collins remained aboard the command module while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin transferred into the lunar module Eagle and began their descent toward the surface. Everything proceeded according to plan until the onboard guidance computer unexpectedly began issuing alarm after alarm. Mission Control had only seconds to determine whether these warnings represented a fatal failure or a manageable overload. Their decision was simple but monumental: continue. Moments later, Armstrong looked through the spacecraft's window and realized the computer was guiding Eagle toward a dangerous field filled with massive boulders. Taking manual control, he carefully flew beyond the hazard, while fuel reserves dropped to critically low levels. Every second increased the risk that the landing would have to be aborted. Finally, with less than a minute of usable fuel remaining, Eagle settled gently onto the lunar surface. When Armstrong calmly transmitted the words, "Houston, Tranquility Base, here. The Eagle has landed," years of pressure, uncertainty, sacrifice, and relentless work suddenly gave way to celebration. Engineers who had devoted entire careers to Apollo embraced each other inside Mission Control. Across the United States, millions watched history unfold in real time. Several hours later, Armstrong climbed down the ladder and placed his boot onto the surface of the Moon, speaking words that would become immortal. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. America had done what many experts once considered impossible. It had not simply caught the Soviet Union, it had accomplished the one objective that mattered most. The nation that had spent years trailing behind had ultimately defined the finish line itself. More than 400,000 people had contributed to the Apollo program, transforming a bold political promise into one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. The space race had begun as a contest between two superpowers, but it ended as something far greater. It became proof that when extraordinary ambition is matched by scientific innovation, determined leadership, and the willingness to learn from failure, humanity can accomplish feats that once belonged only to imagination. More than 50 years later, the footprints left in the lunar dust remain untouched, serving as a permanent reminder that history does not always belong to those who start first. Sometimes it belongs to those who refuse to stop until the impossible becomes reality. And remember, leave the like and subscribe to the channel.